Wyoming Territory, 1879. The early autumn sun hung low over the windswept plains, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape that had broken more spirits than it had nurtured. Among the scattered sagebrush and prairie grass, a lone figure on horseback paused atop a ridge, surveying the vast emptiness before him with a mixture of reverence and wariness. Andrew Dawson pulled his hat lower against the glare, his 25-year-old frame tense in the saddle as he scanned the horizon. 5 years working cattle had weathered his skin beyond his years, though his clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes preserved something of youth that the frontier hadn't yet stolen. He was handsome in the unaffected way of men who spent more time with horses than people, strong jawline, broad shoulders, hands calloused from years of rope and reins. "Come on, boy," he murmured to his chestnut gelding, nudging him forward. "Cattle ain't going to drive themselves." Andrew had learned early that the wilds of Wyoming took more than it gave. His parents' small homestead had fallen to drought and debt when he was 16, his father dead from pneumonia a year later, his mother returning east to family shortly after. The lesson had been clear. Attachment was a luxury the frontier didn't permit. He'd spent the years since keeping to himself, speaking when necessary, working hard, and avoiding the complications that came with letting others too close. The Rocking J Ranch employed him for his skill with horses and cattle, not his conversation. The other hands called him Shadow for his quiet ways and tendency to disappear when the crew headed to town for whiskey and women. He told himself it was better this way. A man alone couldn't be disappointed. A man alone survived. The West doesn't care for dreamers, his father had told him once, just survivors. Andrew believed it with the certainty of scripture. The frontier was no place for love, just work, endurance, and if you were lucky, a quiet piece of land to die on. That was all a man could reasonably hope for in this unforgiving country. As the setting sun stretched his shadow across the prairie grass, Andrew spotted movement in the distance, the distinctive silhouette of a wagon struggling along the rutted trail that passed for a road in these parts. He frowned. Travelers were rare this far from the main routes, especially as winter approached. Probably lost, he figured, not his concern. He turned his horse away, intending to circle back toward the herd he was meant to be watching, when the sharp crack of a gunshot echoed across the open land. Andrew reined in his horse, who danced nervously beneath him. A second shot followed, then a third. Without conscious decision, he found himself spurring his mount toward the wagon, covering the distance at a gallop. As he drew closer, he saw the wagon had listed badly to one side, a broken wheel. 2 figures crouched behind it while 3 mounted men circled like wolves, firing occasionally. Road agents, bandits, the scourge of the territory. Andrew drew his Winchester from its saddle scabbard. He wasn't one to involve himself in others' troubles, but some lines couldn't be crossed, even in a land with few rules. He circled wide, using a small rise for cover, then positioned himself where he could fire without endangering the wagon's occupants. His first shot went high, a warning. "That's far enough," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. The bandits wheeled, startled by the new threat. Andrew levered another round into the chamber and fired again, closer this time, kicking up dirt near the lead rider's horse. "Next one finds flesh," he promised, the steel in his voice carrying across the open ground. The 3 men exchanged glances, clearly recalculating their odds. With a curse, the leader signaled retreat and they galloped away across the prairie. Andrew approached the wagon cautiously. A man in his 50s emerged first, a shotgun still clutched in his hands, his face pale beneath his beard. "Much obliged, stranger," the older man called out, lowering his weapon. "They've been dogging us since midday." Andrew nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You're off the main trail," he observed. "Willowcreek's that way." He gestured eastward. "Took a wrong turn back at the fork," the man admitted. "I'm Thomas Ellis, this here's my daughter." From behind the wagon stepped a young woman, and Andrew felt something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. She was perhaps 20 years old, with honey blonde hair partially escaping from a practical braid. Her blue calico dress was dusty from travel but well-made, and despite the ordeal, she stood straight-backed and composed. What struck Andrew most, however, were her eyes, green as spring grass, direct and unafraid as they assessed him. "Eleanor Ellis," she said, stepping forward and offering her hand as if they were meeting at a social rather than in the middle of nowhere after a shootout. "You have impeccable timing, mister." Dawson, he replied, awkwardly removing his glove to shake her hand. Andrew Dawson. Well, Mr. Dawson, she continued, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement that seemed impossibly out of place against the wild backdrop, it appears we owe you our lives. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Just passing by, he mumbled, already regretting his involvement. Your wheel's broken, won't make Willowcreek tonight. Thomas Ellis sighed heavily. Any chance of shelter nearby? We've supplies, but with those men possibly returning. Andrew hesitated. The Rocking J bunkhouse was 5 miles back. The foreman wouldn't take kindly to him bringing strangers, especially a woman. But leaving them exposed on the plains, with night coming and bandits about, wasn't an option his conscience would permit. There's a line shack about 2 miles north, he said finally. Basic shelter, you can stay there tonight, I'll help with your wheel come morning. Relief washed over the older man's face. Again, we're in your debt. Eleanor Ellis said nothing, but her gaze remained on Andrew, curious and measuring, as if seeing beyond his dusty exterior to something he himself wasn't aware existed. It made him profoundly uncomfortable. We should move, he said gruffly, lights fading. As they gathered the Ellis's belongings and secured their remaining mule to Andrew's horse to drag the disabled wagon, Eleanor worked alongside her father with practiced efficiency. No tears, no complaints about their circumstance, just determined action. Are you traveling far? Andrew asked despite himself as they began the slow journey toward shelter. Denver, eventually, Thomas replied. We're coming from Philadelphia. Eleanor's mother passed last winter and there's nothing left for us there. My brother has a mercantile in Denver, offering us a fresh start. Andrew nodded, stealing a glance at Eleanor, wondering what she thought about being uprooted from civilization and dragged across the continent. To his surprise, when she caught his look, she smiled slightly. I've always wanted to see the West, she offered, as if reading his thoughts, though I admit it's more dramatic than the novels suggest. Something about her steady voice and direct gaze unsettled Andrew more than any bandit could. As they trudged toward the lined shack in the gathering dusk, he found himself hoping morning would come quickly, bringing with it the chance to send these travelers on their way and return to his solitary existence. What he couldn't know was that the wheel breaking on the Ellis wagon would prove to be the event that would break open his carefully constructed isolation, forcing him to confront the emptiness he'd mistaken for safety all these years. The lined shack was little more than 4 walls, a roof, and a small stone fireplace, but after the endless expanse of open prairie, it felt almost cozy. Andrew built a fire while Thomas tended to their mule and the remaining supplies. Eleanor organized what food they had, combining their provisions with the meager stores kept at the shack for emergencies. Not much, but it'll do, she announced, laying out a simple meal of beans, jerky, and biscuits from their journey stores. We're fortunate you came along, Mr. Dawson. I'm not certain what we would have done otherwise. Andrew accepted a tin plate, careful not to let their fingers touch. Been out here long enough to know trouble finds travelers quick. And how long is that? She asked, settling onto a rough-hewn bench across from him. 5 years with cattle, before that 2 with my parents trying to homestead. The words came out before he could stop them. He rarely spoke of his past. Thomas joined them, gratefully accepting his portion. Homesteading's a hard go. We considered it, but at my age, I'm better suited to commerce than breaking sod. Wise decision, Andrew replied flatly. Eleanor studied him over the rim of her tin cup. You don't sound like you're from the West originally. Andrew stiffened. Ohio doesn't matter now. Everything that shapes us matters, Mr. Dawson, she countered gently. Even the parts we wish to forget. Her insight struck uncomfortably close. Andrew focused on his food, hoping she'd attribute his silence to the typical reticence of Western men rather than the discomfort she stirred within him. Eleanor fancies herself something of a student of human nature, Thomas said with fatherly indulgence. Too many books and not enough practical concerns, if you ask me. Books provide different practical concerns than cattle, father, she replied with good humor. Though I admit they didn't prepare me for quite how vast this country truly is. She turned to Andrew. Is it always this empty? He considered her question seriously. Not empty, just unforgiving of mistakes. Land's got its own rules out here. Those who respect them survive. And those who don't. Andrew met her gaze directly. Don't. Something in Eleanor's expression suggested she found his bluntness refreshing rather than off-putting. Then we're fortunate to have a guide who understands those rules. Just until your wheel's fixed, he reminded her, uncomfortable with her apparent faith in him. You'll be on your way to Denver tomorrow. Of course, she nodded, though something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced the encounter would be so brief. After the meal, Thomas soon dozed off in the corner, exhausted from the day's ordeal. Andrew intended to sleep outside, both from a sense of propriety and his own discomfort at being confined with others, but Eleanor stepped outside as he was preparing his bedroll beneath the stars. "Aren't you cold out here?" she asked, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders against the autumn night chill. "Used to it," he replied, not looking up. Eleanor settled onto a rough stump nearby. Above them, the Wyoming sky blazed with stars in a display impossible to witness from any city. "I've never seen anything like this," she breathed, tilting her face upward. In Philadelphia, the gas lamps and coal smoke hide most of the stars. Despite himself, Andrew followed her gaze upward. One good thing about nowhere, clear skies. "Is that how you see it?" Nowhere. There was genuine curiosity in her voice. Andrew hesitated. Most people are just passing through. Land stays, sky stays, people don't. "And you prefer it that way," she observed. It wasn't a question. He finally looked at her directly. The moonlight silvered her blonde hair and softened her features, but her eyes remained sharp, observant. "Safer," he said simply. "Safer than what, Mr. Dawson?" The question hung between them. Andrew had no answer he was willing to voice. Eleanor smiled slightly, seeming to understand his silence. "Well, I find it beautiful, this nowhere of yours, frightening in its vastness perhaps, but beautiful nonetheless." She stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "Thank you again for your help today. Not everyone would have intervened." "Anyone would have," he muttered. "No," she said with surprising certainty. "They wouldn't." She paused at the door of the shack. "Good night, Mr. Dawson." Long after she disappeared inside, Andrew remained awake, staring at the stars that suddenly seemed different somehow, as if he were seeing them through her eyes rather than his own. It was an unsettling sensation, this awareness of another's perspective intruding on his carefully maintained solitude. He told himself it was merely the disruption to his routine, the responsibility of these travelers temporarily under his protection. By tomorrow evening they would be gone and his life would return to its proper order. Yet as sleep finally claimed him, it was Eleanor's clear green eyes that followed him into dreams, not the endless Wyoming sky. Morning brought practical concerns that temporarily pushed aside Andrew's discomfort. He rode out at first light to retrieve tools from the rocking jay, explaining the situation to the foreman, who grudgingly gave him the day to help the travelers, provided he made up the work later. When he returned to the line shack, he found Eleanor outside alone, sketching the landscape in a small book. "You draw," he observed, dismounting. She closed the book quickly, almost embarrassed. "Just impressions. Nothing skillful." "Let me see." The request surprised them both. Hesitantly, she opened the book. The sketches were simple but captured something essential about the land, its vastness, its indifference, but also its stark beauty. "These are good," he said honestly. "My mother taught me," Eleanor replied, a flicker of sadness crossing her features. She believed one should record journeys. Memory fails, but drawings remain. Andrew nodded, understanding the sentiment more than he cared to admit. "We should get started on the wagon. Where's your father?" "Checking our supplies. He's worried about reaching Willowcreek before dark." They worked through the morning. Thomas proved handy enough with tools, and Eleanor surprised Andrew by pitching in without complaint, holding parts in place and fetching what was needed without being asked. By midday they had removed the broken wheel, salvaged what parts they could, and fashioned a temporary but serviceable replacement that would get them to town. As they secured the last bolts, Andrew found himself working alongside Eleanor, their hands occasionally brushing. Each time he pulled back as if burned. "I don't bite, Mr. Dawson," she said quietly after the third such incident. He kept his eyes on the wheel. "Force of habit, don't work with women much. Or people in general, it seems." He glanced up, expecting judgment in her expression, but found only gentle observation. By choice, he admitted. May I ask why? Andrew focused on tightening a bolt. People leave or die. Either way, getting attached just means hurting later. The words emerged more honestly than he'd intended. He immediately regretted them. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. That's a lonely philosophy. It's a realistic one, he countered. Is it? She handed him a wrench. My mother died last winter. It devastated my father and me. But neither of us wishes we'd loved her less to spare ourselves the pain of losing her. Andrew had no response to that. Her simple statement challenged the foundation of beliefs he'd built his adult life upon. There, he said instead, giving the wheel a final check, should hold until you reach town. The blacksmith there can fix it properly. Thomas approached, relief evident as he examined their work. Excellent job, we're ready to depart then. Andrew nodded, already planning his return to the herd and regular duties. I'll escort you to the main trail. Shouldn't have trouble from there. As they loaded the last of their belongings, Eleanor approached him while Thomas hitched their mule. I wanted to thank you properly, she said, holding out a book. This is for you. Andrew stared at the offered volume. I can't take your book. I have others. This one, it made me think of you. Her cheeks colored slightly. It's about a man who believes himself better off alone until circumstances prove otherwise. Reluctantly, he accepted the slim volume. I don't read much. Perhaps it's time to start, she suggested with a small smile. The journey to the main trail passed quickly and in relative silence. When they reached the point where their paths would diverge, Thomas shook Andrew's hand vigorously. We're headed to the Copper Creek Hotel in Willowcreek tonight, then on to Denver. If you're ever in either place, you'd be a welcome sight. Andrew nodded noncommittally. Safe travels. His eyes met Eleanor's for a final time. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of possibilities never to be explored. She held his gaze steadily. Goodbye, Mr. Dawson. I hope you find what you're looking for out here in your nowhere. With that, they were gone, the wagon creaking down the trail toward town. Andrew watched until they disappeared from view, then turned his horse back toward the rocking Jay, telling himself the heaviness in his chest was merely fatigue from a disrupted routine. That evening in the bunkhouse, while the other hands played cards and exchanged coarse jokes, Andrew found himself opening the book Eleanor had given him. Inside the cover, she had written in a neat, flowing hand, "The wilderness has much to teach us, but perhaps the most important lessons come from those we meet within it." He closed the book quickly, disturbed by how the simple inscription affected him. He tucked it beneath his pillow, out of sight but not, he would discover in the coming days, out of mind. 2 weeks passed. Andrew resumed his duties, working longer hours than required, exhausting himself so sleep would come quickly and without dreams. He avoided town, ignored the occasional ribbing from the other hands about his rescue of the travelers, and tried to forget green eyes that seemed to see through his carefully constructed walls. The book remained unread but always present, moving from his pillow to his saddlebag, carried like a talisman he both wanted to discard and couldn't bear to part with. Autumn deepened toward winter. The ranch prepared for the coming cold, moving cattle to protected pastures, storing hay, repairing buildings against snow and wind. Andrew worked mechanically, his body present while his mind increasingly wandered to questions he'd long avoided. What exactly was he surviving for? Was existence without connection truly living? The 3rd week after the encounter with the Ellises, unexpected business took Andrew to Willowcreek. A brewing storm threatened the region, and the foreman needed supplies before the trails became impassable. As the most reliable rider, Andrew was dispatched with a list of necessities and orders to return before nightfall if possible. He completed his errands efficiently, the loaded packhorses ready for the return journey by early afternoon. The storm clouds on the horizon gave him pause, however. Darkness would fall early, and being caught on the open range in a blizzard meant certain death. Reluctantly, he secured rooms at the only establishment in town, the Copper Creek Hotel. As he signed the register, the name several pages back caught his eye. Ellis, Thomas, and Eleanor, 3 weeks ago. Something wrong, mister? The clerk asked, noting his hesitation. No, Andrew replied, quickly finishing his signature. Just wondering about the weather. Bad one coming, the clerk confirmed. Smart to stay put tonight. In his room, Andrew paced restlessly. Knowing they had been here, slept in one of these same rooms, perhaps looked out these same windows at the Wyoming landscape, created an unexpected intimacy that disturbed him. He tried to remind himself they were long gone, halfway to Denver by now, already forgetting the quiet cowboy who had briefly crossed their path. Unable to remain confined, he went downstairs to the hotel's small dining room for an early supper. The place was nearly empty, most travelers having either departed early or elected not to start journeys with the storm approaching. As he mechanically ate his stew, the door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and a single figure bundled against the growing wind. The woman unwrapped her scarf, shaking snow from her cloak. Andrew froze mid-bite, certain he was hallucinating. Eleanor Ellis stood in the doorway, her cheeks flushed from the cold, snowflakes melting in her blonde hair. For a moment he considered ducking his head, pretending not to notice her, allowing her to pass through this town without the awkwardness of their unexpected reunion. Before he could decide, she turned, scanning the room, and her eyes locked with his. The surprise on her face quickly gave way to a genuine smile that transformed her features. Without hesitation, she crossed to his table. "Mr. Dawson, what an extraordinary coincidence." Andrew stood awkwardly, napkin still in hand. "Miss Ellis, I thought you'd be in Denver by now." "As did I," she replied, amusement in her voice. "May I join you, or would that violate your principles of solitude?" The gentle teasing caught him off guard. He gestured to the chair opposite him, acutely aware of his dusty clothes and unshaven face. "What happened to Denver?" he asked as she settled across from him, ordering tea from the passing server. Eleanor sighed. "Many things, none of them according to plan. Father fell ill shortly after we arrived here. Nothing serious, but enough to delay our journey. By the time he recovered, early snow had made the mountain passes treacherous." She glanced toward the windows where snowflakes now swirled visibly. "We've taken rooms here until spring. And your father, he's well now." "Quite recovered, thank you. He's secured temporary work at the general store, and I've found employment teaching the local children." She studied him. "And you? Still maintaining your splendid isolation?" Andrew shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "Ranch work keeps me busy." "I see you survived without our interference," she observed, her tone light but her eyes searching. "Though I confess, I've wondered if you ever opened that book." He hesitated, then answered honestly, "Carried it, haven't read it yet." "But you kept it," she noted, something like satisfaction in her expression. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of her tea. In the momentary silence, Andrew found himself noticing details about her, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, how her fingers curled around the teacup seeking its warmth, the faint freckles across her nose visible now that he was closer. "Will you be staying in Willowcreek tonight?" she asked, blowing gently across her tea. He nodded toward the windows. "Storm's coming, no choice." "Then perhaps you might join Father and me for dinner. He'd be delighted to see you again, and we owe you a proper meal at the very least." Every instinct told Andrew to decline politely and retreat to his room, yet he heard himself saying, "That would be nice." Eleanor's smile brightened. "Wonderful, 7 o'clock. We take our meals in the private dining room, Father's arrangement with the proprietor." As she stood to leave, she hesitated. "I'm glad to see you again, Mr. Dawson." "Truly." After she departed, Andrew remained at the table, unsettled by the encounter and his own unexpected reaction to it. He had spent years carefully avoiding entanglements, keeping interactions brief and impersonal. Yet in the span of a brief conversation, Eleanor Ellis had once again breached defenses he'd thought impenetrable. More disturbing still was the realization that part of him welcomed the intrusion. Dinner with the Ellises proved far less uncomfortable than Andrew had anticipated. Thomas greeted him like an old friend, insisting he take the seat of honor and peppering him with questions about the territory and ranch life. The private dining room was modest but well appointed, with actual china plates instead of tin and a small fire crackling in the hearth. "Miss Ellis tells me you're staying until spring," Andrew said as they ate. Thomas nodded. "Not our original plan, but perhaps fortuitous. Gives us time to learn about the territory before committing to Denver. Eleanor has already made herself indispensable to the town." Eleanor smiled modestly, hardly indispensable. The children needed instruction and I needed occupation, a fair exchange. She's being modest, Thomas continued proudly. The school committee practically begged her to take the position when the previous teacher eloped with a cattle buyer. 12 students now ranging from 6 to 16, he chuckled. I think half the town's bachelors have suddenly developed an interest in education, finding reasons to linger near the schoolhouse when classes dismiss. Father, please, Eleanor murmured, a flush coloring her cheeks. Andrew found himself unexpectedly irritated by the image of town men circling Eleanor like wolves around a campfire. The feeling surprised him with its intensity. And yourself, Mr. Dawson? Thomas asked, oblivious to his daughter's discomfort or Andrew's reaction. What brings you to town during such weather? Ranch supplies, he replied, forcing his attention back to the conversation. Got caught by the storm. Well, their misfortune is our good luck, Thomas declared. How long will you remain? Just until the storm passes, tomorrow likely. Eleanor looked up from her plate. So soon. The weather report suggests snow through the weekend. Can't be away from the ranch that long, Andrew said, though in truth his duties could wait. It was his own discomfort driving his eagerness to depart. Perhaps while you're here you might visit Eleanor's school, Thomas suggested. The children would surely be fascinated by a real cowboy. I couldn't, Andrew began. That's an excellent idea, Eleanor interrupted, her eyes brightening. The older boys in particular would benefit from meeting someone who works the land. Most of them will likely follow similar paths. Trapped between their enthusiasm, Andrew found himself agreeing to visit the small schoolhouse the following morning, weather permitting. The commitment sat uneasily within him, like a saddle poorly fitted. As the evening progressed, however, he found himself relaxing incrementally in their company. Thomas shared stories of their journey west, while Eleanor occasionally interjected with observations that revealed her sharp intelligence and quiet humor. They asked about his experiences without prying into painful territory, and for the first time in years, Andrew found himself speaking at length, describing the beauty and harshness of ranch life with an eloquence that surprised even himself. When the clock struck 9, Thomas excused himself, citing fatigue and business in the morning. As he departed, he clasped Andrew's shoulder warmly. You've done well for yourself, son. Not many your age show such responsibility and character. The simple praise affected Andrew more than he cared to admit. He'd spent so long avoiding connections that receiving genuine approval felt almost foreign. Alone with Eleanor, an awkward silence descended. Andrew knew he should excuse himself as well, but something kept him rooted to his chair. Would you like coffee? She asked. Or perhaps something stronger. I believe they keep brandy for medicinal purposes. Coffee would be fine, he replied, relieved to have the silence broken. As they waited for the server to bring fresh coffee, Eleanor studied him with that direct gaze that seemed to see beyond his carefully constructed exterior. May I ask you something personal, Mr. Dawson? He tensed but nodded. What happened to make you so determined to remain apart from others? You're clearly intelligent, capable of conversation when you choose, not unpleasant to look at. She smiled slightly at his discomfort with the observation. Yet you've built walls higher than most prison fortresses. No one had ever asked him so directly. The bluntness of her question deserved honesty in return. My father died believing the West would provide for us, he said slowly, the words coming with difficulty. Worked himself to death on land that never gave back what he put into it. Mother couldn't bear staying after that, said the territory had stolen her husband and her dreams. Left me to make my own way at 17. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression compassionate but not pitying. I learned that hoping for anything out here just sets you up for disappointment, he continued. Better to expect nothing, want nothing beyond the basics. That way you can't lose what you never had. And has that approach brought you happiness, Mr. Dawson? The question struck him like a physical blow. Happiness had never been his goal, merely survival, the avoidance of pain. The idea that he might deserve or expect more had long since been buried beneath the pragmatic concerns of daily existence. Happiness is a luxury, he said finally. Eleanor considered this, turning her coffee cup slowly between her palms. I disagree. I think happiness is a necessity, as essential as air or water, just less immediately fatal in its absence. She looked up, meeting his eyes. A slow suffocation of the spirit is still suffocation. Her words penetrated defenses he hadn't realized were weakening. Andrew found himself unable to counter her argument, uncertain whether he wanted to. "It's late," he said instead, standing abruptly. "Thank you for dinner. I'll visit the school tomorrow, weather permitting." Eleanor rose as well. "I've overstepped, I apologize." "No," he said quickly, "you just ask questions I haven't considered." The hint of a smile touched her lips. "Perhaps it's time you did." As Andrew made his way to his room, snow now falling heavily outside, he realized with disturbing clarity that Eleanor Ellis had accomplished in 2 brief encounters what years of solitude had failed to prevent. She had made him question the very foundations upon which he had built his carefully isolated existence. Sleep eluded him that night, his thoughts repeatedly returning to her words and the uncomfortable truths they suggested. By morning, the snow had indeed continued, but rather than feeling trapped by the weather, Andrew found himself grateful for the extension of his stay in Willowcreek. The thought was terrifying in its implications. The schoolhouse was a simple structure at the edge of town, 1 room with a pot-bellied stove, rough-hewn benches for the students, and a small desk at the front where Eleanor stood as Andrew entered, brushing snow from his coat. 12 children of varying ages stared at him with undisguised curiosity. "Class, this is Mr. Dawson," Eleanor announced, her eyes brightening at his arrival. "He works at one of the cattle ranches in the territory and has kindly agreed to tell us about his experiences." Andrew had never felt more out of place than standing before these children, their expectant faces turned toward him. He removed his hat awkwardly, cleared his throat, and began speaking haltingly about cattle, horses, and the changing seasons on the range. To his surprise, the children listened raptly. They asked questions, intelligent ones about animals, weather patterns, and survival skills. Under Eleanor's gentle guidance, the session evolved from the uncomfortable ordeal he had anticipated to an engaging exchange. She occasionally prompted both him and the students with questions that bridged their different worlds, creating connections where he had expected only distance. By the time the noon bell rang, Andrew found himself somewhat reluctant for the visit to end. The children filed out for their midday meal, several of the boys lingering to ask final questions about his horse and whether he had ever faced down outlaws. When the last child departed, Eleanor approached, a smile warming her features. "You were wonderful with them, particularly Thomas Jenkins. He rarely speaks in class, but he asked you 3 questions." Andrew shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise, just answered honestly. "Precisely why they responded to you." Children recognize authenticity. She began straightening papers on her desk. "Will you join me for lunch? The hotel prepares a basket for me daily." They sat near the stove, sharing bread, cheese, and apples as the snow continued to fall outside. Through the windows, Andrew could see the white blanket deepening across the town, transforming the rutted streets into a pristine landscape. The isolation that would normally have comforted him now felt different somehow, less like protection and more like a shared intimacy. "How did you become a teacher?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Eleanor looked pleased at his initiative. "My mother taught music in Philadelphia. I assisted her from the time I was 16. When she fell ill, I took over her students." A shadow crossed her face. "After she passed, teaching became both my livelihood and my connection to her." "You're good at it," he observed. "The children respect you." "Teaching is largely about seeing people as they truly are, not merely as they present themselves," she said, her gaze meeting his directly. "Rather like drawing, capturing the essence beneath surface details." Andrew had the distinct impression she was no longer speaking about the children. "And what do you see when you look at me, Miss Ellis?" The question emerged before he could reconsider it. Eleanor studied him for a moment, her green eyes thoughtful. "I see someone who has mistaken isolation for safety, someone who believes himself unremarkable yet demonstrates extraordinary kindness and perception when given the opportunity." Her voice softened. "Someone afraid to want anything because wanting leads to loss." Her assessment was so accurate it left him momentarily speechless. No one had ever seen him so clearly, or perhaps no one had ever bothered to look beyond his deliberate reticence. You've decided quite a lot based on limited acquaintance, he finally managed. Perhaps, she acknowledged. Or perhaps some people reveal their character more clearly in brief, unguarded moments than others do over years of superficial interaction. The schoolhouse door suddenly burst open, ending their conversation as a man in his 30s entered, bringing a swirl of snowflakes with him. Miss Ellis, sorry to interrupt, but Doc Johnson sent me to fetch you. Mrs. Peterson's time has come, and with the midwife down with influenza, he needs assistance. Eleanor rose immediately. Of course, Mr. Bennet. Please tell the doctor I'll be there directly. She turned to Andrew. I must go. First babies often come slowly, so I may be gone for hours. Of course, he replied, standing as well. I should return to the hotel anyway. As she gathered her coat and scarf, Eleanor paused. Will you still be here tomorrow? The storm shows no sign of abating. Yes, he said, surprising himself with the certainty of his answer. I'll be here. Something like pleasure flickered in her expression. Then perhaps we might continue our conversation. I feel we were just approaching something important. After she departed, Andrew remained in the schoolhouse a moment longer, looking at the simple classroom with its books and slates and evidence of Eleanor's careful attention. It struck him that she had created a small world here, a place of connection and purpose in a harsh territory that often denied both. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder what it might be like to have such connections of his own, not just to the land and animals, which had been his only constants, but to people. To a person, the thought no longer terrified him as it once would have. Instead, it nestled uncomfortably but persistently in his mind as he made his way back through deepening snow to the hotel, a foreign object his consciousness couldn't quite reject nor fully accept. The storm intensified overnight, howling around the eaves of the hotel and sealing Willowcreek off from the surrounding territory. Andrew woke to a world transformed, snowdrifts higher than a man's head against buildings, streets invisible beneath the white expanse, the few people braving the cold moving like dark specks against the brilliant landscape. In the hotel dining room, Thomas Ellis sat alone at breakfast, looking worried. Eleanor hasn't returned, he explained when Andrew inquired. Mrs. Peterson's labor was difficult, the message from Dr. Johnson says both mother and child are well now, but with the storm, he felt it safer for Eleanor to remain at the Peterson home rather than risk the journey back. Sensible decision, Andrew agreed, though he felt an unexpected disappointment at her absence. Would you join me for breakfast? Thomas asked. I find I've grown accustomed to company at meals these past weeks. Over eggs and coffee, the older man spoke of his plans for Denver, the dry goods store his brother had offered to sell him, the modest house they hoped to purchase, the future he envisioned for Eleanor. She deserves more than I've been able to provide these past years, Thomas said, a hint of melancholy in his voice. Her mother and I had such dreams for her, university education, perhaps, or marriage to someone who could appreciate her particular qualities. She seems content with teaching, Andrew observed. Thomas nodded. For now, yes. Eleanor has always found satisfaction in helping others, but a father worries. He studied Andrew thoughtfully. She spoke quite highly of you after our first encounter, you know. Said you possessed an integrity rare in any place, but particularly valuable in the West. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to this revelation. I've embarrassed you, Thomas said with a small smile. Forgive an old man's directness. I simply wanted you to know that your assistance was appreciated more than you perhaps realized. The conversation turned to safer topics, the weather, the town's preparations for winter, stories of Thomas's earlier life in Philadelphia. Yet Andrew found his thoughts repeatedly returning to the notion that Eleanor had spoken of him in his absence, had formed impressions beyond their limited interaction, had perhaps thought of him as he had, despite himself, thought of her. By afternoon, the storm had subsided enough that Eleanor was able to return to the hotel, pink-cheeked from cold but bright-eyed with the excitement of having helped bring new life into the world. A perfect baby girl, she announced as she joined Andrew and her father for an early dinner. 8 pounds if she's an ounce, with a hearty set of lungs. Mrs. Peterson did beautifully, though it was certainly a lengthy ordeal. Her natural enthusiasm as she described the experience, carefully editing details for propriety, captivated Andrew. Here was someone who engaged fully with life, who found joy in service, who approached difficulties as opportunities rather than burdens. The contrast with his own carefully measured existence could not have been starker. After dinner, Thomas excused himself early, claiming fatigue from worry. As he departed, he gave Andrew a look that suggested his withdrawal was not entirely due to exhaustion. Left alone again, Eleanor suggested they move to the small parlor adjacent to the dining room, where a fire burned cheerfully in the hearth. "I believe we were interrupted yesterday just as our conversation was becoming interesting," she said as they settled into chairs near the fire. Andrew found himself both dreading and anticipating the resumption of their discussion. "You have a direct way about you, Miss Ellis." "Life is too short for unnecessary circumlocution," she replied with a slight smile. "Particularly in territories where death arrives with little warning." A bleak assessment for someone who seems to find joy in small things. "Not bleak, realistic, like you. I recognize the harshness of this place." Her expression grew thoughtful. "The difference, perhaps, is that I believe the beauty and connection possible here are worth the risks they entail." Andrew studied the fire, gathering his thoughts. "When I found you and your father on the trail that day, I'd just ridden past. Decided it wasn't my concern. But you came back," she said softly. "That's what matters." "What made you leave Philadelphia?" he asked, changing the subject. "Truly, beyond your father's brother and the mercantile." Eleanor considered the question. "After Mother died, nothing felt right anymore. The city seemed to close in around us, too many memories, too much that reminded us of absence rather than presence." She looked directly at him. "I think you understand something about that." He nodded, recognizing the feeling she described. "The West represented something different," she continued. "Not an escape precisely, but a place where we might build something new without the constant shadow of what we'd lost." She smiled slightly. "I hadn't anticipated quite how literal the building would be, nor how challenging, but I haven't regretted our decision. Even stranded in Willowcreek for the winter." "Especially that," she replied, her gaze holding his. "Some detours prove more valuable than the planned journey." The implication in her words created a warmth within him that had nothing to do with the fire. Andrew found himself at a crossroads he had never anticipated, one where the path of continued isolation suddenly seemed far less appealing than it once had. "I've been reading your book," he admitted, "the one you gave me." Surprise and pleasure lit her features. "Have you? What do you think?" "The man's a fool," he said bluntly, pushing away connection out of fear, then wondering why he feels empty. Eleanor's eyes sparkled with suppressed laughter. "That's rather the point of the story, I believe." "I'm beginning to see that," he replied, holding her gaze. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Andrew felt himself standing at the edge of a precipice, terrified of falling yet somehow more afraid of stepping back. "The storm will break tomorrow," he said finally. "I'll need to return to the ranch." Disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Of course, your responsibilities." "But I could return," he heard himself saying. "Next week, perhaps, to check on you and your father," he added hastily. "Ensure you're managing with the winter." Eleanor's smile returned, warming him more effectively than any fire. "I believe we would welcome that very much, Mr. Dawson." "Andrew," he corrected quietly, "I think. Given our conversations, perhaps you might call me Andrew." "Andrew," she repeated, the sound of his name and her voice creating a sensation he couldn't quite identify. "And I'm Eleanor, though my friends sometimes call me Ellie." "Ellie," he tested, finding the diminutive suited her, softer than her full name, yet still carrying something of her essential strength. As the evening drew to a close, they parted with the promise of his return. Walking her to her room, Andrew felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest, as if something long compressed had begun to expand. "Good night, Andrew," she said at her door. "Safe journey tomorrow, if we don't speak before you leave." On impulse, he took her hand. The contact sent a current through him, both terrifying and exhilarating. "Good night, Ellie." As he released her hand and walked to his own room, Andrew recognized with sudden clarity that regardless of weather or road conditions, his departure from Willowcreek tomorrow would not be an ending but a beginning, the first conscious step away from the isolation he had mistaken for safety. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, he felt something dangerously close to hope. The weeks that followed transformed Andrew's carefully ordered existence. True to his word, he returned to Willowcreek the following weekend, finding reasons to make the journey that became increasingly transparent to both himself and the ranch foreman. "Got yourself a girl in town, Dawson?" The older man asked after the third such trip, his weathered face creased in knowing amusement. Andrew's denial lacked conviction even to his own ears. Each visit followed a similar pattern: dinner with Eleanor and Thomas, often followed by long conversations with Eleanor alone by the fire in the hotel parlor. Sometimes they walked through the snow-covered town when weather permitted, Eleanor pointing out changes since his last visit, introducing him to townspeople who increasingly greeted him with familiar nods rather than the suspicious glances typically reserved for strangers. Between visits, he found himself working with renewed energy, completing tasks more efficiently to justify his absences. The other hands noticed the change, their good-natured teasing both irritating and oddly satisfying, evidence that the transformation he felt internally was visible to others as well. December arrived with bitter cold but brought with it the town's Christmas preparations. On his visits, Andrew found himself drawn into these activities, helping hang decorations in the schoolhouse, assisting with repairs to the church roof, even reluctantly agreeing to play a shepherd in the children's pageant. "You're becoming positively sociable," Eleanor teased during one such visit, as they hung paper ornaments her students had made. "The mysterious lone cowboy is developing distinct community tendencies." "Temporary insanity," he replied, though his smile belied the words. "Blame the holiday spirit." "Is that all I should blame?" she asked, her tone light but her eyes searching. Andrew paused, ornament in hand. Over the past weeks, something had grown between them, unspoken but increasingly undeniable. He had never been a man comfortable with words, preferring action to declaration, yet he recognized that some things required voicing. "No," he said finally, "not all." The simple acknowledgement shifted something between them. Eleanor's smile softened, and when their hands met passing decorations, neither pulled away quite so quickly. As Christmas approached, Andrew faced a dilemma. The ranch traditionally required all hands to remain through the holiday, managing cattle that needed extra attention during the coldest days of winter. Breaking this tradition would mark him clearly as someone whose priorities had changed. After much internal debate, he approached the foreman directly. "Need Christmas Day in town," he stated plainly. "Happy to work Christmas Eve and the day after, double shifts if needed." The older man studied him thoughtfully. "Must be some girl," he observed. "Never known you to ask for special treatment in 5 years." "She is," Andrew admitted, the words feeling strange but right in his mouth. "Special." To his surprise, the foreman nodded. "About time you found something besides cattle to care about. Be back for morning feed on the 26th. Christmas morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Andrew rode into Willowcreek as the sun crested the eastern mountains, the frozen landscape glittering like diamond dust in the early light. He carried with him 2 carefully wrapped packages, presents that had required considerable thought, and a special order from the mercantile owner who had eyed him with new respect when he explained what he wanted. The town was quiet, most families celebrating privately before the community gathering planned for afternoon at the church. Andrew stabled his horse and made his way to the hotel, where Thomas and Eleanor had arranged for a private breakfast in their suite. Thomas greeted him warmly at the door. "Andrew, Merry Christmas. We weren't certain you'd make it with your ranch responsibilities." "Wouldn't have missed it," Andrew replied, removing his hat as he entered. Eleanor emerged from the adjoining room, and the sight of her momentarily stopped his breath. She wore a green dress he hadn't seen before, the color perfectly matching her eyes, her blonde hair arranged more elaborately than usual. She looked, he thought, like spring in the midst of winter. "Merry Christmas, Andrew," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure at his arrival. "You must be half frozen." Breakfast passed pleasantly, the small sitting room decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, a tiny tree on the side table adorned with candles and simple ornaments. They exchanged stories of Christmas traditions, Eleanor and Thomas describing elaborate Philadelphia celebrations, Andrew sharing quieter memories of his childhood in Ohio and the more practical observances of ranch life. After the meal, Thomas announced it was time for presents. He presented Andrew with a fine leather-bound journal. "For a man who has begun to discover he has thoughts worth recording," he explained with a knowing smile. Andrew thanked him, touched by both the gift and the insight behind it. He then gave Thomas the larger of his packages, a set of drafting tools he had noticed the older man admiring in the mercantile window. "For planning your Denver store," Andrew explained. "The owner said these were the best quality." Thomas appeared genuinely moved. "Remarkably thoughtful, my boy. These will indeed be put to good use." When it came time to exchange gifts with Eleanor, Thomas discreetly busied himself arranging the room for their later departure to the church. Eleanor's gift to Andrew was a book, not surprising given their initial connection, but this one clearly selected with particular care. "Poetry of the American Landscape," he read from the cover. "Open it," she urged softly. Inside she had inscribed, "For Andrew, who sees the beauty of this land through eyes that understand both its harshness and wonder, may you find your voice to describe what you see so clearly. With deepest affection, Ellie." The inscription affected him deeply. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "This means a great deal." "You haven't been easy to understand," she said with a small smile, "but I believe the effort has been worthwhile." Andrew handed her the small package he had carried. "This isn't much," he warned as she unwrapped it. Inside the simple box lay a silver brooch shaped like a wildflower native to the Wyoming Territory, delicate yet sturdy, with a small pearl at its center. "Oh, Andrew," she breathed, lifting it carefully, "it's beautiful." "Reminded me of you," he said simply, "something that thrives where most would consider nothing could grow." Eleanor looked up, her eyes bright with emotion. "Will you pin it on for me?" The request was innocent enough, yet Andrew felt its significance as his fingers carefully secured the brooch to her dress, the brief contact and proximity causing his heart to race in a way no dangerous ranch work ever had. "There," he said, stepping back, "perfect." "Thank you," she replied softly. "I shall treasure it always." The moment stretched between them, filled with words neither quite knew how to say. Andrew had never been a man to act impulsively, yet he found himself suddenly certain of what he wanted in a way he had never experienced before. "Ellie," he began, only to be interrupted by Thomas's return. "We should prepare for church," the older man announced, either oblivious to or politely ignoring the charged atmosphere. "The service begins at 11. The moment passed, but something had shifted. As they walked through the snow-covered streets to the small church, Andrew found himself beside Eleanor, their steps naturally falling into rhythm. Without conscious thought, he offered his arm. She took it with a smile that suggested no words were necessary. The church was crowded, the entire town seemingly present despite the cold. Andrew found himself seated between Eleanor and Thomas, acutely aware of Eleanor's shoulder occasionally brushing his as the congregation sang carols and listened to the preacher's message of hope and new beginnings. Afterward, the town gathered in the adjoining hall for a community dinner. Andrew, who would once have avoided such gatherings at all costs, found himself surprisingly comfortable, listening to Eleanor's students excitedly show her their Christmas gifts, discussing cattle prices with local ranchers, even participating in the good-natured teasing that passed between townspeople who had weathered many winters together. As afternoon faded toward evening, Andrew realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with land or work and everything to do with the connections he had begun to form, particularly with the woman who now stood across the room, laughing at something one of her students had said. Later, as they walked back to the hotel through gently falling snow, Thomas tactfully suggested he needed to rest before evening services and continued alone, leaving Andrew and Eleanor to walk more slowly through the quiet streets. "Thank you for coming today," Eleanor said, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "I know it required special arrangement." "Worth it," he replied simply. They paused at the edge of the town square, where a large pine had been decorated with candles and simple ornaments. In the gathering dusk, with snow falling gently around them, it created a scene of unexpected beauty. "I never thought I'd find this," Andrew said suddenly. "The tree?" Eleanor asked, puzzled. "No," he turned to face her, "this feeling. Like I belong somewhere, with someone." The directness of his statement clearly surprised her. "Andrew. I'm not good with words," he continued, determined now to express what had been building within him. "Never have been, but these past weeks. You've changed something in me, Ellie, made me see that what I thought was protecting myself was really just hiding from life. Eleanor's eyes shone in the dim light, and what do you see now? That some risks are worth taking, he said, reaching for her hand. That connection doesn't have to mean pain, that you, he paused, gathering courage, that you matter to me in ways I never expected anyone would again. She stepped closer, the cloud of her breath mingling with his in the cold air. You matter to me too, Andrew. From that first day there was something about you, something true and honorable beneath all your careful distance. Snowflakes caught in her eyelashes, on her cheeks. Andrew had never seen anything so beautiful. May I kiss you, Ellie? The question emerged barely above a whisper. Her answer came not in words but in action as she raised herself on tiptoes, her lips meeting his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with the release of weeks of growing affection. Andrew's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the snow continued to fall around them, insulating their moment from the rest of the world. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Eleanor's cheeks were flushed with more than just cold. That was worth waiting for, she murmured. Andrew smiled, a full, unreserved expression rarely seen on his features. Definitely. As they walked back to the hotel, hand in hand through the snowy streets, Andrew recognized that the path ahead remained uncertain. His life at the ranch, her teaching position, Thomas's plans for Denver, all presented practical challenges to whatever might grow between them. Yet for the first time in years, uncertainty didn't feel like a threat but a promise, the possibility of a future richer than the careful existence he had constructed for himself after loss. That night, as he prepared for his pre-dawn departure back to the ranch, Andrew wrote his first entry in the journal Thomas had given him, Christmas Day, 1879. Today I learned that the heart, like the Western Territories, contains undiscovered country, vast and sometimes frightening, but worth exploring nonetheless. January brought the harshest weather of the season, making travel between the ranch and town increasingly difficult. Andrew managed only 2 visits to Willowcreek during the month, each journey a battle against snow and wind that would have deterred him completely just months before. During these brief reunions, his relationship with Eleanor deepened. They spoke of their pasts more openly, Andrew sharing the pain of his parents' failures and losses, Eleanor revealing her own fears about the uncertain future and the responsibility she felt toward her father. Each conversation removed another brick from the walls Andrew had built around himself over the years. February arrived with a devastating blizzard that isolated the ranch completely for nearly 2 weeks. Cattle needed constant attention, preventing any possibility of travel. Andrew found himself thinking of Eleanor constantly, worrying about conditions in town, frustrated by his inability to communicate. When the trails finally cleared enough for safe passage, Andrew rode into Willowcreek with a new resolution forming in his mind. The forced separation had clarified something he had been considering since Christmas, the nature of the life he truly wanted and what he was willing to risk to achieve it. He found Eleanor at the schoolhouse teaching her afternoon class. She couldn't hide her joy at seeing him, though she maintained her professional demeanor before the students, merely welcoming him as a visitor and continuing the lesson. After the children departed, however, she crossed the room quickly and embraced him, her relief evident. I was so worried, she confessed. Reports of the conditions were frightening. It was bad, he acknowledged, holding her close for a moment before stepping back. Lost some cattle, but the men are all safe. And you look tired. He smiled slightly. Not enough to keep me from coming as soon as the trail cleared. They walked together to the hotel, where Thomas greeted Andrew warmly. Over dinner, the older man shared news of a letter from his brother in Denver. The snow had closed mountain passes completely, delaying any possibility of their journey until late spring at the earliest. I confess I'm not entirely disappointed, Thomas admitted. Willowcreek has grown on me these past months. The shopkeeper has even suggested I might consider taking over his business when he retires next year. And you, Ellie? Andrew asked, glancing at Eleanor. Would you be disappointed to remain? I've found unexpected satisfaction in teaching here, she replied thoughtfully. The children need consistency, particularly after losing their previous teacher so abruptly, and there are other considerations that make Willowcreek increasingly appealing. Her gaze met his briefly, conveying meaning beyond her words. After dinner, they followed their established pattern, Thomas retiring early, leaving Andrew and Eleanor to the privacy of the parlor. This evening, however, Andrew felt an uncharacteristic nervousness, the weight of the decision he had reached during the forced separation pressing on him. "I missed you," Eleanor said as they settled near the fire. "More than I perhaps should admit." "I missed you too," he replied, taking her hand. "Made me think about a lot of things." She studied his face. "You seem different somehow. Is everything truly well at the ranch?" Andrew nodded. "It's not the ranch, it's me. These past months, you've changed me, Ellie, made me see possibilities I'd convinced myself didn't exist." "Is that a good thing?" she asked softly. "The best," he assured her. "But it's led me to some decisions I need to share with you." Eleanor's expression grew serious. "That sounds significant." "It is," Andrew took a deep breath. "I've been saving money these past 5 years. Not much to spend it on out at the ranch. Been thinking about what to do with it, maybe buy a small spread someday, run a few cattle of my own." She nodded encouragingly. "That's a sensible ambition." "There's a piece of land about halfway between here and the Rocking J," he continued. "Previous owner gave up after 2 bad seasons. Banking agent in town says it can be had for a fair price." He paused. "I made an offer yesterday," he accepted. Surprise registered on Eleanor's face. "Andrew, that's wonderful news, your own ranch." "Just 160 acres, he said modestly. "Small cabin needs work. Good water supply, though, and decent grazing, enough to start building something." He hesitated, gathering courage. "Something I'd like to build with you, if you're willing." Eleanor went very still. "What exactly are you saying, Andrew?" He met her gaze directly. "I'm saying I love you, Ellie, have since Christmas, maybe before, probably should have said it sooner." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm saying I want a future with you. As my wife, if you'll have me." Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Are you certain? Just months ago you were determined to remain alone." "Most certainty I've ever felt," he replied honestly. "You showed me what I was missing, not just you, but connection, community, purpose beyond mere survival." He reached up to brush a tear from her cheek. "I can't promise it will be easy. Ranch life is hard, especially for a woman used to city comforts. But I promise to work every day to make it a home we can both be proud of." "Yes," she said simply, her voice filled with emotion. "Yes, Andrew. I love you, and I would be honored to build that life with you." He kissed her then, pouring into the embrace all the feelings he'd struggled to articulate. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band. "It's not fancy," he apologized, holding it out. "Had to guess the size." "It's perfect," she assured him, extending her hand. The ring slid onto her finger as if made for her. "Absolutely perfect." "Should speak to your father," Andrew said, suddenly remembering propriety. "Ask his blessing properly." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "Yes, though I suspect he won't be surprised. He's commented more than once on the change in you these past months." They found Thomas in his room, reading before bed. The older man listened to Andrew's formal request with dignified attention, then broke into a broad smile. "My boy, nothing could please me more than entrusting Eleanor's happiness to a man of your character." He embraced Andrew, then his daughter. "Your mother would be so proud, my dear. She always said you had the wisdom to recognize a good man when you found one." Plans quickly formed around the engagement. The wedding would take place in April, when spring made travel easier for Andrew's ranch colleagues to attend. Andrew would continue working at the Rocking J until then, using his days off to prepare the cabin and land for Eleanor's arrival. "Will your father live with us?" Andrew asked as they discussed arrangements. Eleanor shook her head. "He's quite taken with Mr. Peterson's offer to buy into the mercantile here in town. I think he's found his place, just as we've found ours." That night, as Andrew prepared to return to the ranch, he held Eleanor close under the starlit sky. "I never thought I'd find this," he murmured against her hair, "someone who makes me want to be more than just a survivor. And I never imagined my Western adventure would lead me to someone who understands both strength and gentleness so completely," she replied. "We're rather perfect for each other, aren't we?" "We are," he agreed, marveling at the certainty he felt. a certainty born not of naivete but of the deep knowledge that came from recognizing one's true path after long wandering. As he rode back to the ranch through the cold night, Andrew felt a warmth within that no winter could touch. The vast Wyoming sky stretched above him, no longer a reminder of his insignificance but a canopy sheltering the future he and Eleanor would build together. April 15, 1880 dawned clear and mild, with wildflowers beginning to dot the prairie and new green grass pushing through the winter-brown landscape. In the small church in Willowcreek, Andrew stood at the altar in a new suit, watching as Eleanor walked toward him on her father's arm. Her dress was simple but elegant, cream-colored with delicate embroidery, her mother's lace veil framing her face. She wore her hair loose around her shoulders, adorned only with small white flowers. On her breast, the silver wildflower brooch caught the light filtering through the church's windows. As she reached him, taking his hands in hers, Andrew felt a completeness he had never imagined possible. The preacher spoke of commitment and partnership, of weathering life's storms together, of building something lasting in a world of impermanence. When Andrew spoke his vows, the words came easily, without the hesitation that had once characterized his speech. Eleanor's voice was clear and confident as she promised herself to him, her green eyes never leaving his blue ones. The small church was filled with well-wishers, Eleanor's students and their parents, townspeople who had come to respect both the schoolteacher and the quiet cowboy who had gradually become part of their community, ranchers and cowhands from the Rocking J who had watched Andrew's transformation with bemused approval. After the ceremony, a celebration spread across the town square, tables laden with food, music from fiddles and guitars, children playing between the clusters of adults sharing stories and laughter. Andrew found himself surrounded by people who no longer felt like strangers but neighbors and friends. As evening approached, he and Eleanor prepared to depart for the cabin that would be their home, no longer a dilapidated shelter but a modest yet comfortable dwelling, transformed through Andrew's labor during the preceding months. He had repaired the roof, added a small porch, furnished the interior with simple but sturdy pieces, even planted Eleanor a garden that awaited her touch. Thomas embraced them both before they left. "You have my greatest blessing," he told them, his eyes suspiciously bright, "and the comfort of knowing I'm near enough to visit but not so near as to interfere." Eleanor laughed, kissing her father's cheek. "We'll expect you for Sunday dinners, and I'll still come to town twice weekly to teach." As they drove the wagon toward their new home, the setting sun gilded the landscape in shades of gold and rose. Eleanor leaned against Andrew's shoulder, her hand resting comfortably in his. "Are you happy?" he asked, the question carrying none of the uncertainty it once might have. "Completely," she assured him. "And you? Any regrets about abandoning your solitary existence?" Andrew smiled, the expression now coming naturally to him. "Not a single one. Turns out what I thought was safety was just emptiness wearing a different name." As their cabin came into view, lanterns already lit inside thanks to the foreman's wife, who had gone ahead to prepare for their arrival, Andrew felt a surge of pride and gratitude. The simple structure represented everything he had once believed impossible, a home built on love rather than mere survival, connection rather than isolation, hope rather than resignation. "Welcome home, Mrs. Dawson," he said as he lifted Eleanor from the wagon, carrying her across the threshold as tradition dictated. Inside, she looked around with evident pleasure at the care he had taken. The polished wooden floors, the curtains hung at windows that had been properly glazed, the small bookshelf already holding her favorites alongside the volume she had first given him. "It's perfect," she declared, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Absolutely perfect." Later, as they stood on the porch watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, Eleanor in the circle of Andrew's arms, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a chance encounter on a lonely trail to a love that had transformed his understanding of what life could offer, every step had led them here, to each other, to this land, to a future neither could have imagined alone. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, tilting her face up to his. "That some trails look dangerous but lead exactly where you need to go," he replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "And that I'm the luckiest man in the territory to have found you." "Not luck," she corrected gently. "Courage, the courage to help strangers on a broken wagon, the courage to let someone see past your carefully built walls." She reached up to touch his cheek. the courage to love despite knowing its risks. Andrew covered her hand with his own. Worth every risk, he assured her. As they stood together beneath the endless western sky, their future stretching before them like the vast prairie, full of challenges but also promise, hard work but also joy, Andrew Dawson knew with absolute certainty that he had found what he hadn't even known to seek. Not just survival, but a life truly worth living, with a woman whose strength and tenderness matched the land they would build their dreams upon. In the wild, a shy cowboy had indeed met a daring woman, and their love had proven unstoppable, transforming not only their lives but their understanding of what it meant to truly live in this harsh but beautiful frontier.